My professional interest kind of crossed with the Wabash more when I started researching and writing a new history of Indiana State University. Because then, and this is the first volume of that will come out in the spring of 22. But clearly, when you start dealing with the history of Indiana State University, you're dealing with the history of Terre Haute, and then you're dealing obviously with a city that owes its very existence to the river, and even it's the height of its industry. Late 19th, early 20th century. When Terre Haute was growing, mainly due to industrial expansion, some of which maybe wasn't directly related to the river, but it was always a resource that allowed for that capacity to grow. You had to understand how central that was to the city. Now, the funny thing, that the times where the river kind of entered into Indiana state history and more directly in the city was times of disasters, when there were floods. But part of what's new about what I focus on in the history of Indiana State is student life. The previous history really didn't deal much with that. That existed. He wrote that in 1946. But for instance, first I'm like, when students started having what you might call quasi-sororities and fraternities, this is back in the 19-teens and 1920s, they started taking river excursions. There were party boats that you were able to rent on the Wabash, and they had bands like the Jazz Pirates, and they would so these groups, usually they would be, like I said, quasi-fraternities and sororities, localized fraternities and sororities. In the summers, they would have party excursions on the Wabash, and they would have bands, and they would have dances on these boats in the river as they cruised up and down. There were at least 6 or 7 in a summer, and so that was one of the first examples where really deeply entered into my professional interests, was the reality that the river that we kind of take for granted. It's you cross the river, it's interesting to look at, it's pretty. Of course, I've paid attention to riverscape and all the development on the river since I've lived here. But again, you kind of take it for granted. But then you realize there is a rich history of interacting with the river that clearly goes back, of course, a couple centuries. But it was I think Hoshians and local folks interacted with the river a lot more than we do now, and so one of the things I like about riverscape and this more attention to the river is it's kind of a returning to interacting with the river in a healthy, positive way. And again, the first time I encountered that was these listening to the Jazz Pirates as they cruise up and down the Wabash in the 1920s. You can imagine Indiana State University girls that were like flappers, and they're going out and they're having a good time on the river. But I'm like, wow, that's really cool. Why can't we have that anymore? Why can't we have party barges on the Wabash? When did that end? So that's where some of my newfound interest in the river, in the Wabash itself, and the usages of the Wabash historically began to surface.